Hi, welcome to Just Salvos Live. Today we're talking to National Director of TIER Australia, Matthew Maury. We're going to be talking all about the developing world. We're going to be talking about solutions to poverty, and it's going to be a great conversation. It's coming up next. Well, we're here with the National Director of TIER Australia, Matthew Maury. Matthew, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
We just want to talk first of all about TIER Australia because we don't know heaps about it in the Salvation Army. Can you tell us a little about what is TIER Australia and some of the things that you do?
Sure. Yeah, TIER Australia, actually we're celebrating our 40th birthday this year. We were created 40 years ago. Out of the Evangelical Alliance. We were created to respond to emergencies and relief situations specifically, and over the 40 years have developed into more of a relief and development organization. So engaging with projects overseas and also engaging with the church here in Australia.
Okay, can you tell us about some of the projects overseas? What would that look like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, most of our projects are involved in some sort of integrated community development work, which means not just focusing on one aspect of poverty, but looking at poverty in its whole and saying if you're going to address root causes of poverty, you really, one, need to understand the situation, and two, need to address it across all things, including health and education and income generation. So most of our projects would be broad in that they'd engage with communities in kind of across all of those things. We work right now in about 25 countries in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And our priority and our vision is to work with really the most marginalized and the poorest communities. So TIER often doesn't go where it's easy to work, but goes where it's difficult to work and where people are in greatest need. And usually there's a correlation between those two things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sits really nicely with the mission of the Salvation Army. So already I'm seeing ways that you guys can get involved in TIER Australia, which we would love to do. Tell us about what you do here in Australia, so how we could get involved.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the ways that TIER Australia is a little bit different than some of the other international Christian agencies is we do have a big focus on engaging with Christians in Australia. So our work is about doing things overseas, but it's also about how do we as Australian Christians respond to what the Bible says about poverty and justice. And so we have 5 ways that we try to encourage people to get engaged. We encourage people to pray for the work that we do. We encourage people to get involved in advocacy, and we have specific ways that people can do that. To learn, to understand what poverty is, what causes it, and how we live our lives here in Australia contributes to what might be broken in global systems. To give financially to support the work and to support the work of justice. And then to change the way that we live. So it's not enough just to think that by giving money to a project overseas, that's going to solve the problem, but actually to realize that discipleship and the way we live our lives here in Australia actually matters. It matters to God and it matters to the poor.
That's absolutely key. So how do you get people to go on that journey?
Well, through a variety of things. A lot of it's relational engagement. A lot of it's telling the stories of our partners. We really focus a lot on storytelling and letting our partners and their worldview speak into the context here in Australia. So we have publications like a magazine called Target, which we put out a couple of times a year, which really digs deep into the issues of how Australians can respond, understanding the issues and how people can respond. We have simulations that people can get involved with. And we're involved in Micah Challenge, which is one of the advocacy coalitions of Christian agencies that encourages the church to get involved in advocating and making people realize that the way they vote actually matters to God and matters to issues of poverty.
Yeah, so. It's key, but we can't know that stuff until we're educated. Well, you talked about one of the ways of engaging people is through a simulation, and we've got a clip now we would love you to watch talking about Slum Survivor.
Well, hi, my name's Matt Anslow. I'm the Young Adults Coordinator with TIER Australia. And just behind me over here, we have an activity that TIER runs called Slum Survivor. First, a little bit about TIER. TIER is a Christian aid and development organisation. We actually, one of the main things that we do is we actually educate and help Australian Christians to make a biblical response to poverty. And so this is one of the ways that we do that. It's a simulation experience that we run. And basically what it is that people come and they have to build their own slum out of some materials that we get from wherever, pallets, cardboard, plastics, tarpaulins. They have to build their home for a weekend or a week or however long. And then they in a very small way, experience what life is like for some of the poorest people in our world. Currently in our world, around 1 billion people live in slums, and they can be anywhere from a couple of people up to a full-size family of 5, 6, 7 or more children. And it can be a very small place. I've seen slums where you might have 12 or so people sleeping in a space that is literally only about 6 foot by 6 foot, so very small. And it's a heartbreaking reality in our world. Often that reality is attached, with the issue of poverty, to some other issues in our world. Our guys, as they're doing Slum Survivor, they have to complete certain challenges. They have to make so many paper bags to eat their meals, which at the end of the day, they only get 2 meals a day of rice and dal, very simple stuff. And they might have people come along and actually knock down their slum to, I guess, simulate in a small way a natural disaster or something that might happen that might affect their livelihood and their home. And for many people in our world, climate issues and issues around trafficking and issues around disease and hunger, that's daily life for them. And we can hardly understand that. We can hardly understand what it's like to not be able to get enough to eat, or to be in danger of contracting AIDS when you go to work, or to be in constant danger of a climate disaster totally washing away or knocking down your home. And I guess what TIR wants to do is to be able to encourage Australians through simulations like this and through our education to be able to make that biblical response to poverty. What can we do? How can we pray? How can we learn? How can we speak up? How can we change our own lives, and how can we give?
It actually sounds like a really good thing to do. I'm not sure that I'm keen enough to slum it, but I would love young people around Australia to be engaged in this program. It sounds amazing. How can we get involved in Slum Survivor?
Well, if you want to learn more about Slum Survivor or about the publications that TIR puts out or any of those things, you can go to our website, www.tir.org.au. And there's links on educational resources, and you can search the site for things like Slum Survivor and other simulations that we offer for churches and people to get involved with.
That's fantastic. So get to that website. We'll have that on the Facebook as well for you. Look, we want to talk really specifically about poverty and what that looks like. I feel like we kind of have this image in our head of the starving children of Africa, and some of that was really good marketing and campaigning back in the 80s, and those images are burnt into my brain. Is that an accurate picture? Is it a helpful picture for us to look at? What are we talking when we say poverty in the developing context?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I talk about poverty, I've spent about 18 years working in Africa, actually, and working with communities that are facing poverty. And when I come back and share with people in Australia about poverty, I usually take a step back and say, well, what does the Bible say about poverty, and why does poverty exist? And without going through kind of a long biblical explanation, but really looking at the fall that happened in the garden and the brokenness of how we no longer have this shalom with God, and the story of the Bible from that brokenness up to Christ's return being the story of God wanting to reconcile the world to himself. And the broken relationships that were created, both the relationships between each other, the relationships with the world, and our relationships with God, and how, if you understand this brokenness and then see how they play out in different systems around the world, then you have you have a framework at least to say, if this is what is broken, then this is how you can address the problems. And to give a very specific example, such as economic systems. If economic systems are broken because we don't treat each other well, or we're willing to exploit people, or we want to get cheap things in Australia, so we want to get the lowest price, and we're always pushing for the lowest price, and that means in the end people overseas are being paid unfair wages or being exploited, then we actually are complicit in some of the causes of poverty. So I think it's really important to step back and look at that, and also to look at that poverty is about broken relationships at its core. So poverty isn't just about something that exists overseas. We all experience poverty in our own lives as well, and in our own societies. And if you have that framework, and then you go and walk alongside communities and say, how can we rebuild your community? Then you really, as I said before, start from a holistic understanding of what's broken and how do you address things. Because if you just go in and provide food, you're not really solving some of the underlying issues. If you just provide one intervention or the other, you're not solving it. You have to understand the issues and then understand how a community can be empowered to overcome those issues on their own. And I think I just came back from Nepal, and one of the things that I was really encouraged to see as I visited Nepal was one of our partners who works in very remote and isolated communities. And their approach to overcoming poverty, I think there's a lot that we can learn from it. They don't go in with a lot of financial resources. They don't go in with a preconceived project design. They go in and say to the community, what are the resources that already exist here? What do you have? What are the challenges you're facing? And how can we start from where you are and start to overcome the challenges that you face in a way that's sustainable, in a way that actually does look at the bigger issues of how they can get involved in what the government may not be working, or the systems that were set up to that are disenfranchising them, they can actually work to overcome. So in some ways, it's extremely complex as you look at those issues. But in some ways, it's extremely easy too, because if you work effectively with partners and they can really get the sense of what is broken and how to walk alongside a community, true change can happen.
What are some of the biggest frustrations in that journey towards, I guess, both educating people here in, say, Australia about this journey, but then also just the obstacles in terms of getting people and communities out of poverty?
Look, one of the most probably controversial things that we say in Australia, and is perhaps one of the biggest obstacles, is getting people to recognize that how they live their lives here in Australia actually does contribute to the issue. And just to pick on one example that I think really illustrates that, if you look at the resources that it takes to live an average middle-class life in Australia, it requires somewhere between 5 to 7 planets, Earths of resources for everyone on Earth to live at this level. So if success is living like a middle-class Australian, it's simply never going to be something that everybody on this planet can aspire to. So if what we care about is actually equity and people being treated fairly and justice, then I think one of the most challenging issues is us saying, well, that means we have to live differently. Yeah. We have to consume differently. And it means we have to consume less and live in a more simple way and be more generous with what we have. Yeah. And that's a really confronting message. It's a confronting message for me and how I make decisions about how I live my life here. It's a confronting message for all of us. But that really is one of the biggest obstacles. Yeah. Again, it's not just about sending money. It's about how we consume and how we live our lives. And God cares about that.
That's a hard marketing pitch. That's really hard to do. I mean, I guess, how do we capture someone's heart so that they go on that journey? Yeah.
No, it is really hard. And I think one of the ways I know that my heart was touched by that is by hearing the stories of our partners, by getting building some of the relationships and those links between what life is like in a country in Africa or in Asia, and having that story and that relationship told, and trying to, I mean, the great thing about technology is that you can build linkages without having to travel. And so we're looking at how we can take advantage of getting those stories told through video or through people coming and here and sharing their story. But I think that's a big part of it, is actually understanding what reality is like. But it is a hard marketing message. It's a hard message for all of us. But as you look at the Bible and you look at how Jesus lived his life, he was constantly giving hard messages. Yeah. There was not a place that he went that he didn't say something that was confronting and challenging. And I think at its essence, that's what's true about the gospel today. It's still a challenging message for us.
Yeah, and we're going to have to take some of this on faith. And I bring up the issue of climate change, and there's a whole bunch of people saying, it doesn't exist, and others saying, yeah, it really does. What's Tyr's perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said before, our big focus is on what our partners are telling us. So we're not an organization with scientists. We don't get into big debates about what the science is necessarily. But what we do know is that the lives of our partners are changing. The rainfalls have changed. Production has changed in terms of their farming techniques. Most of the poor around the world are rural farmers. And so when the climate and environment that they live with changes, it has a significant impact on their life. And we know from firsthand stories from our partners around the world that these things are changing. And so it's a message for us that if these things are changing, then again, are we contributing to this, and how do we live differently? Yeah. And our view is that we are. And our view is that we actually are. How we treat creation matters, and that we have a biblical. We need to take that seriously.
Yeah, so. And it's interesting as well, just even from a Christian perspective, but also from a human perspective, this whole question of even if it's not man-made, like even if we aren't contributing to it, it's no reason to not actually look at the way you're treating the earth and the way that your excess consumption is affecting others and actually making a couple of decisions, I'm assuming.
Yeah, well, that's right. And look, I've yet to talk to somebody who said that they think pollution is good or they think treating the environment badly is a good thing. So, I mean, I think at one level people agree that actually God has given us this world and we are to be good stewards of it. I think the challenging message is to take a bigger view of, again, what we consume and the things that we see as normal life and how that actually does damage the environment.
Yeah, okay. I want two more things, then we're going to finish, I promise.
Sure.
One, give us a picture of somebody in the developed world who is living perhaps that more socially conscious life that is having a positive impact on the developing context. What does that look like, being as someone who is not excess consuming?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's easier in the developing world. You're saying the developed world or developing world?
Developed
world.
Us, me. Tell me how I'm supposed to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge that I think each of us deals with every day. I mean, I think it's as you go, a friend of mine who's an economist said, you know, we often think about the resources that we have to contribute to God's work, and it's, you know, it's the extra, that's what we give to the church or what we give to organizations like TIER. But most people, the biggest use of their money over the course of their life is going to be what they spend in a grocery store, how much money they put in the grocery store. So you actually have the grocery store, if you look at that as a place where you can actually, you spend more resources and you can actually afford social change. So looking at things that are fair trade, looking at things that are ethically consumed, looking at how far produce came in terms of the miles it took to bring it to your community and the environmental impact on those things. I think that's one place that you can start. There's things like the Ethical Consumer Shopping Guide that people can get as a resource to help them think those things through. So that's a really basic way to start, but again, in terms of how much money you spend over the course of your life, it could actually be the biggest impact that you make. So.
Yeah. Okay, and one final story, if you would. You've talked to us about some of your stories that you hear from your partner organisations. Is there a story of hope, something that we can just go, okay, things are changing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the best parts about my job is getting to go overseas and visit our partners. And in the media, we often hear the negatives about what's not working, and there are problems in every sector, and certainly in this sector as well. But I continue to be encouraged about the change that I see. Again, I'll take an example from Nepal. One of our partners there who's very committed to sending its staff out to live incarnationally and to be part of change in communities. And I got to sit down with a women's group in one of those communities. And it was women who were made up of, from low caste Dalits to the higher caste, who were sitting together. And as they talked to me about what had changed in their community, they talked about the fact that 5 years before, none of them would have even spoken to each other because of the differences in caste. 5 years before, they didn't have toilets, and so the health and sanitation in their community was much worse. 5 years ago, they weren't literate and they didn't know how to read. So over the course of this 5 years, starting from a standpoint of working with some of the basic things the community needed, the relationships were restored, the community was a healthier community, it was a happier community, it was a community where people were interacting and taking care of each other. And just to illustrate, they gave me one example that was a really tangible one. They said that a woman had lost her children and had been quite ill, and the community came together and took care of her in her time of need. And you know, we live in a very individualistic society here in Australia, but that's true all over the world. People tend to think of themselves first. And so I think models of communities that you go into where people are caring for each other, where people are loving each other, where health is improving, where the economic situation is improving, those are real stories of hope, and those are stories of transformation. And I think at their core, they're the story of the gospel, you know, Christ intervening in this world and making a change.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you so much for giving us your time and talking to us about that today. We would love for you to check out the TIER Australia website. We want for you to go to TIER and get involved in some of the things that they have, whether it be just education or actually actively involved in either giving or in participating in some way. It's really important for us to support the developing world. We need to do our part, and some of that is changing our own ways, and some of that is really getting involved specifically in certain contexts. So thank you for being a part of it.
Sure.
And
thank you for having me.
We'll see you all next week on the next Just Salvos Live.